HOA detains black teen running, but didn't expect his father was a federal judge. Welcome to HOA Karen Files, where I will take you through real-life, dramatic, yet equally bitter stories of power abuse, racism, and the fight for justice. Today, we will follow the surprising and dramatic story of a family in Oak Ridge Heights, a neighborhood that seemed peaceful but hides painful truths beneath the surface. This story begins with a very ordinary action, jogging. But this simple act led to Jordan Carter, a 16-year-old boy, being arrested and facing an unexpected legal battle. Why? Simply because Karen Harris, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, decided that her power must be imposed on everyone and that a black teenager jogging in her neighborhood was an intruder. What happened next? Jordan, with the support of his father, Anthony Carter, a federal judge, did not let this injustice go unchallenged. What did they do to fight back against Karen's power and the HOA? Would she have to pay for her racist and unreasonable control? This story is not just a battle between father and son against an organization, but a symbol of the struggle for personal freedom, justice, and equality. You won't be able to take your eyes off each twist and turn, and you will definitely reflect on the deep issues this story raises. Follow until the end of the story to see the surprising conclusion and feel the power of justice when it is executed. Don't forget to comment below the video to share your thoughts on the story. What do you think of the unreasonable rules imposed by the HOA? And do you believe the power of such a small organization can really change our lives? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now to not miss out on the next stories in HOA Karen Files, where justice and truth are always brought to light. I am Anthony Carter, a respected federal judge who has worked in the legal system for over 20 years. My job is not always easy, but I am used to facing challenges, complicated cases, and decisions that could change the lives of others. I am not just a judge, I am also a father, and in that role, I always want to provide the best possible life for my son, Jordan. Jordan, 16, is a sports enthusiast. He is not only my pride, but also the joy of my life. Every day, I see him diligently studying and training, and I always encourage him to maintain those healthy habits. Sports not only help Jordan develop physically, but also help him relieve stress, because life is not always easy for a teenager. We live in Oak Ridge Heights, a neighborhood I once considered ideal. Oak Ridge Heights, with its wide streets, beautiful homes, and peaceful atmosphere, was once the place where my family and I felt at peace, where I could relax after stressful work hours. I thought this would be the place for Jordan to grow up in tranquility, not worrying about external troubles. However, in recent years, this neighborhood has started to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. The rules of the Homeowners Association, where Karen Harris, the president, holds significant power, have become increasingly strict and unreasonable. Her decisions no longer seem aimed at protecting the community, but at controlling everything, from how people decorate their homes to who has the right to live here. Oak Ridge Heights, once a peaceful place, has now become a neighborhood full of underlying tension, where the power of a few can determine the lives of all of us. That morning, as usual, Jordan woke up early, around 6:30 a.m. For me, it was a familiar sight. He hurriedly changed into his workout clothes, put on his shoes, and rushed out the door without forgetting to shout, "Have a good day, Dad." Jordan had kept this routine for the past 3 months, and I knew exactly why. At 16, with all the academic pressure, family expectations, and teenage issues anyone at that age faces, jogging had become Jordan's way to relieve stress and seek peace of mind. Jogging not only helped him maintain physical health, but also cleared his mind, allowing him to find relaxation in those early morning hours when the air was still fresh, and the world had not yet been swept into the rush of a new day. Over the past months, I've watched him start his mornings like this, regularly and patiently. It was the only time of the day when Jordan felt he could let go of all his worries and focus solely on the steady steps on the familiar path. I didn't think much about it, as I had gotten used to my son's routine. I thought today would be just like any other day. He would jog, come back after about an hour, we would have breakfast together, and then I would continue my work. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing could prepare me for the sudden change that would confront our whole family just a few hours later. My eyes were still sleepy, not yet out of bed, when my phone suddenly rang. A call without a caller name, but I immediately recognized the number as an unfamiliar one. Without any bad premonitions, I answered, and then Jordan's voice came through the line. His tone was a little worried, unlike his usual self. "Dad, I've been arrested. They said I can't jog in this neighborhood." A moment of silence passed before I could understand what was happening. The feeling was one of surprise, then confusion. No way. Why would my son be arrested just for jogging in our own neighborhood? Jordan's voice hurriedly continued. "They said I'm not allowed to jog on the public road in this neighborhood. I'm at the police station." My eyes widened, and at that moment, I was fully awake. What I was hearing could not be true. When I arrived at the police station, the atmosphere in the room immediately changed. The officers were still sipping coffee and chatting, but as soon as I walked in, everything fell into an eerie silence. There were exchanged glances between them, uneasy and uncomfortable looks. They knew who I was, a federal judge, and I knew this situation wouldn't be simple. I felt the pressure from them, as if they were trying to handle this situation as easily as possible without me getting involved. I had prepared myself for what I was about to face. A simple case wouldn't involve me, but this case was different. Standing before me was Karen Harris, the president of the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association. No one could ignore her presence. Karen stood there, not showing the slightest hint of discomfort or worry, but rather exuding self-satisfaction, as if she had won a battle in an unequal fight. She stood straight, arms crossed, a subtle smile on her face, as if arresting my son was a grand victory she had every right to be proud of. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cold and emotionless, "this neighborhood is not the place for your son to jog without permission." Her words cut through the air like a knife. I knew this wasn't just an empty statement. This was a declaration of power from someone who had too much control. It was like a key turning in a locked door, preventing any further argument. I looked at her, trying to suppress the anger rising within me, and felt the injustice behind these words. A public neighborhood, and now she was treating my son as if he were an intruder. But there was one thing I couldn't overlook. I looked at her again, and then I realized. Her words weren't just about the power of the HOA. They were about racism. Karen, with her hostile tone and arrogant attitude, didn't just see my son as an intruder. She saw him as one because Jordan was a black boy. And in a neighborhood like Oak Ridge Heights, this made a clear difference in how she viewed my son. It was no accident that when my son jogged by, Karen wasn't the first to see him. Other residents had seen Jordan, and no one said anything. But Karen, with her subtle prejudice, took it upon herself to call the police, not hesitating to label him an intruder just because of his skin color and the presence of a young person who wasn't an official member of this community. I couldn't just sit back and accept this. But at that moment, I had to remain calm. A judge, a father, must know when to act and when to step back. I just stared at her, not saying a word, letting the silence speak for itself. Then I turned to the officers. "Do you know," I began, my voice calm but firm, "that arresting my son is an act without any legal basis? It's an abuse of power, and you're all being pulled into a power play that Karen has orchestrated." They didn't answer. The atmosphere grew heavier, and it seemed like they were waiting for me to say something, or for some action from me, to proceed. But I knew I couldn't just leave. I am a judge, and I never let injustice slide without a fight. The whole neighborhood is watching me, and if I don't stand up now, how can I ask others to do the same? Karen Harris had finished speaking, but I could still feel the arrogance in her words. To her, the power she held was everything, and I would be the example for everyone else in this neighborhood. I picked up my phone and immediately called my lawyer. "Start a legal battle," I said. "This is not just about my son, it's about justice." After standing still for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, I looked directly at Karen Harris. Unable to tolerate this injustice any longer, I asked her to explain why my son was arrested for doing something perfectly normal. "Can you explain to me why my son was arrested just for jogging in our neighborhood?" My voice wasn't loud, but it was full of determination and uncompromising resolve. Karen looked at me for a moment, as if savoring the worry in my eyes, before replying. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone cold as if I was asking for something unbelievable. "According to the rules of the Homeowners Association, jogging in this area is considered trespassing and disturbing the peace. This neighborhood is not a park, and we have the right to maintain the quiet for this community." Her response felt like a cold splash of water to my face. Trespassing? I was so surprised that I couldn't believe what I had just heard. This felt like a bad joke. How could something as normal as jogging be considered trespassing? And what angered me even more was that she truly believed this was a reasonable justification. As I stood there, looking at Karen and hearing her unreasonable reasoning, my eyes couldn't help but glance at the HOA regulations board. The words on the board looked like they were taken straight from a handbook designed to control everything in this neighborhood. No changing the color of the gate without HOA approval. This, I understood, was meant to maintain a consistent standard for the homes. But when Karen required residents to register with the HOA before changing even a small color on their gates, I couldn't help but ask myself, is it really necessary to control the color of the gates? Then I saw another regulation. Everyone must register if they wish to park on the sidewalk, even if it's for just 30 minutes. 30 minutes? Even 30 minutes required permission. This was extreme management. I knew that all these rules had no real reason other than Karen wanting to control everything, from the appearance of homes to the smallest thing, like parking in the neighborhood. Having lived here for many years, I always understood that these rules could be helpful in maintaining order, but to this extent, it was truly excessive. Especially when now, my son was being treated like an intruder simply for jogging, a healthy activity that everyone does to maintain their health. Everything was not only unreasonable, but also carried the subtle racism that Karen was consciously perpetuating. The HOA regulations she spoke about, originally meant to maintain order in the neighborhood, had now become tools for her to control residents who didn't fit into the group she wanted to see here. This neighborhood, where everyone should have the freedom to move and enjoy life, had now become stifling, not for the safety of the community, but because of one person's power and the underlying discrimination. Karen Harris, with her overconfidence, had turned this neighborhood into a place for people like her, those with the same skin color and social class. Despite all the injustice in this situation, I did not lose my temper. I knew that in this moment, patience and calmness were more important than ever. Although my heart was boiling with frustration, I remained composed and looked at Karen with a determined gaze. So, according to you, I can't let my son run in a neighborhood I've lived in for years? I asked, my voice cold but filled with unyielding resolve. The question wasn't just to ask for an explanation, but to challenge the power she had arrogantly claimed for herself. Karen didn't answer immediately. She just shrugged, as if my question was not worth explaining. That was the moment I knew that this wasn't just about rules or compliance. This was open abuse of power, where someone, simply because they held power, could impose unreasonable rules on others without facing any consequences. Her silence, her shrug, was a clear sign that she knew exactly what she was doing was wrong, yet she gave herself the right to continue acting this way without fear of the consequences. Right after the tense confrontation at the police station, I could not accept the fact that my son had been arrested so unjustly for something as simple as jogging. Jordan was not a criminal. He was just a 16-year-old teenager, living in a public neighborhood, and jogging was a healthy habit he had every morning. The arrest was an unreasonable and abusive use of power. I could not let this pass as a small incident. This was a symbolic case about personal freedom and justice in the community. I immediately demanded that my son be released. I wouldn't let them keep him for another second. I am a federal judge, and I understood my rights in this situation. I demanded to meet the person responsible for making the arrest decision, the officers who had no legal grounds to detain Jordan. Someone like me could not stand by and let power be abused without fighting back. As soon as I stepped out of the police station, I contacted my lawyer immediately. This was no longer a personal lawsuit. It was a legal battle with a greater purpose: to free Jordan and make the HOA pay for abusing its power. I wasn't just fighting for my son. I was fighting for all the residents in this neighborhood, those who were living under the rule of a powerful group that could impose unreasonable and discriminatory rules without facing any resistance. A formal lawsuit was filed. My goal wasn't just to prove that Jordan was innocent and deserved to be free. I wanted to prove that this abuse of power was a significant danger to everyone's freedom and rights in the neighborhood. And I wanted those behind the HOA, especially Karen Harris, to be held accountable for their actions. Karen and her group could not continue to exist in a neighborhood where its residents only wanted to live in peace and freedom. Every legal battle was a step forward, and I would not stop until justice was served. As the legal battle began, public opinion quickly shifted. Just as I had predicted, this case was not just a simple personal lawsuit. Soon after the news about Jordan's arrest broke, the media began reporting, and social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForJordan and #HOABias. Our story became a major issue, and people began to realize that this was not just an unreasonable act of discrimination, but also a dangerous manifestation of the abuse of power. #JusticeForJordan spread quickly, becoming a call for justice, not just for my family, but for anyone who had ever been oppressed by the abuse of power in their community. Posts, videos, and comments from neighborhood residents who couldn't bear the injustice began to appear more frequently. A movement against Karen Harris and the HOA board quickly formed. This wasn't just happening in Oak Ridge Heights. Social media became the place for residents from other neighborhoods to speak out, sharing their stories about excessive control and the unreasonable rules imposed by their HOAs. The online community began questioning the role of HOAs in residential areas and the strict regulations that many neighborhoods were enduring. This shift became even clearer as neighborhood residents began to realize the absurdity of the HOA's regulations. They could no longer accept such an organization, where one individual could abuse power without facing any consequences. Although some were still afraid or hesitant to confront the HOA, the majority began to speak out. They would no longer accept this unreasonable control. The residents of Oak Ridge Heights began to realize that they were not pawns in Karen Harris's game. And then, a wave of strong support from the neighborhood residents emerged. They began contacting our lawyer, asking to join the fight, or at least sending letters protesting the unreasonable rules imposed on them. A large portion of the residents signed petitions demanding the dissolution of the HOA, feeling that this organization was no longer appropriate and didn't deserve to continue existing in the community. Despite Karen Harris and other HOA members trying to ease the situation, public opinion had completely changed. The entire neighborhood no longer stood silent in the face of oppression and discrimination, and now, they stood with my family, supporting the fight to bring justice for my son. No one imagined that Oak Ridge Heights, a quiet neighborhood, would become the focal point of such a major struggle. Karen had become a symbol of discrimination and unreasonable control. What she thought was absolute power had now become her worst nightmare. In the past, she stood at the peak of power, seeing herself as the guardian of order in this neighborhood. But now, everything had changed. She was facing an unrelenting legal storm. The reason was that now, the entire community had realized that Karen's abuse of power and the HOA's actions were not just an issue for my family. It was an issue for all the residents in the neighborhood. And when public opinion began to awaken, no one could stop this fight. The sense of justice was rising, and Karen Harris was no longer the one holding the decision-making power. She was the one facing the devastating consequences of her actions. While Karen clung to the fake power she once held, the truth was, no one feared her anymore. Her late apologies and awkward handshakes were nothing but acts that couldn't save the HOA from its collapse. As this fight came to an end, I saw clear changes in the neighborhood. The downfall of the HOA was not just a victory for my family. It was a victory for everyone who had suffered from oppression, discrimination, and abuse of power. Karen could not withstand the legal storm, and Oak Ridge Heights was no longer a place of unreasonable rules. Instead, it became a true community, where people could live freely without fear of being controlled by harsh and discriminatory regulations. This victory wasn't just mine. It was for all the residents of this neighborhood. Justice had been served. After months of relentless fighting, with strong support from the public, 82% of the neighborhood residents voted to dissolve the HOA. Karen Harris's power finally shattered, and the ridiculous regulations she imposed on the neighborhood, such as banning the color change of gates or requiring registration to park on the sidewalk for even just a few minutes, have now been completely removed. Karen was no longer in control. The HOA, which she had used to enforce her unreasonable power for many years, no longer existed. A significant change had taken place, and this didn't just mean that my family had won. It also meant that this neighborhood had regained freedom and a true sense of community. With the HOA dissolved, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief. But what truly satisfied me was when I received a call from a friend in the neighborhood. He was someone I had gotten to know since moving to Oak Ridge Heights, a quiet person who clearly cared deeply about the community. He said, "I know you're a judge, but you're the first one to make this neighborhood truly feel like home for us." His words took me by surprise. I never thought what I did would have such a big impact. I didn't do this to become a hero. I just did what I felt was right. But when I heard those words, I felt the power of unity and justice. Yes, I had won, not just for my son, but for all the residents of this neighborhood. They had stood up to reclaim their freedom and fairness. I smiled, and in that moment, I felt like I had won, not only in this legal battle, but in the battle for a livable community where no one would suffer from discrimination or unreasonable control. When I looked at Jordan, he was smiling, proud to know that not just he, but the entire neighborhood was now free. We had protected the values I've always believed in: freedom, justice, and mutual respect. When it was all over, Jordan returned to his jogging routine, but this time, the difference was that he no longer had to worry about being stopped or having the police called on him. He ran freely, without the fear lurking in every step. Oak Ridge Heights, which had once been full of control and discrimination, had now truly become a community worth living in. The residents could communicate freely, no longer bound by ridiculous rules. People were living for each other, for the beauty of freedom and respect for personal rights. I felt incredibly proud of what had been achieved, not just because I had protected Jordan from injustice, but because I had helped restore this neighborhood to its true values, where everyone could live freely without fear of oppression or discrimination. I wasn't a hero, I just did what I believed was right, and that's what the people in this community needed. And I wonder, can we continue to protect these rights for everyone in society? But another question also crossed my mind. Will people like Karen always exist? Those who want to use power to control others? Or can we change and build truly fair and equal communities? With what has happened, I believe we can. If you find this story meaningful and want to follow more about issues related to the abuse of power and how we can fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, HOA Karen Files. Here, we'll continue to explore real-life stories, cases where local governments and organizations may abuse power, and more importantly, how we can stand up and create change. Don't forget to like and share if you think this story deserves to be spread. Let's work together to build a strong community where justice always prevails.